Listen only mode.
Well, good afternoon. This is Frosty Walker, Chief Information Security Officer for the Texas Education Agency. And the first thing that I will ask is somebody will drop me a note and let me know if they can see the monitor as well as check on the audio. So if somebody would drop me a note, I would appreciate that. Welcome to the third and final of our fall 2017 series for webinars regarding cybersecurity. Today we'll be sharing concepts regarding writing cybersecurity related documentation and some of the guidelines. We hope you find this informative. We know that this is not the most shining topic that we can pick, but it is one of the more critical topics that we can discuss, and when we're talking about developing our cybersecurity documentation and the platform and how they're interrelated. So we hope you find this informative. We will allow time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. Should you have a question during the presentation, feel free to submit them, and we'll get them queued up for the Q&A time. The Data Security Advisory Committee reviews all of the information that we share out on the portal and the information and the topics that we'll be talking about today. The DSAC provides guidance to the education communities for collaboration and communication regarding information security issues and resources which can be utilized within the educational communities. The DSAC is currently comprised of representatives from school districts, ESCs, TEA, and we have one member from the private sector. It is diverse in both size and geographically, but they all are willing to share needs, ideas, and time to help promote solutions for everyday cybersecurity issues which may be encountered in the educational communities. I want to thank everybody that might be on the call today that sits on that council. Thank you very much for those that sit on the Data Security Advisory Committee. A recording of today's webinar will be posted in our Texas Gateway portal at https://www.texasgateway.org. Under Cybersecurity Tips and Tools. This is the location that you will actually find all of the information that we've shared for the education community. And if you go to that URL, you will see featured resources, and you'll see cybersecurity tips and tools, and all of the webinars that we have presented so far are posted there, as well as any of the informational resources that we've shared with y'all in the past. Today we're going to talk about, like we talked about, documentation for security and cybersecurity. We're going to talk about a security policy template that has been shared at the portal. We're also going to talk about a non-disclosure agreement template that's been shared on the portal. And we're going to talk about the strategic, tactical, operational planning, and we'll have open discussion. So when we talk about cybersecurity documentation, it's important to understand how those documents work together as well as where they fit. So here is a graphic that I like to use when I'm talking about cybersecurity documentation. And at the very top of that, we have laws and requirements. So we have federal regulations, we have state regulations, you may have local regulations that you need to address when you're writing policies to instruct your users as how best they can use your information security resources. Policies, which are a statement of management intentions, which are, should be very broad statements. Oftentimes people get policies and procedures mixed up. They should be two different documents. Like I said, one that's very broad, and we'll go into more detail about that. And policies is also known as the strategic layer of documentation. The second layer down is referred to as tactical mid-range documentation. And here we have standards and guidelines. And so an example of standard, it says here in the illustration, mandatory implementation. And many of us work with workstations in our work environment. And we do not, when they're rolled out or when they're delivered, they're not built one at a time. They are typically done what they call build a platform or build an image. So they put all the operating system, all the applications that they want everybody using onto that image, and then the workstations are rolled out. So that is a standard. So you would have a standard of what you're offering on your workstations, and that information needs to be documented. An example of guidelines could be how as recommended actions, and again, you want to, those are mid-level range. So you may have guidelines on how you use certain applications, or within the IT department, you may have recommended actions for guidelines. At the operational level, we have procedures. And procedures are step-by-step instructions of how something is done. An example is, and we'll talk a little bit about change management policy. And underneath your change management policy, you may have a lot of different procedures, because within your IT department, you have different functions. For example, you either have vendors or you have in-house staff that's rolling out applications. And those applications are typically versionized. So they're version 1.2, 1.3. They track what changes are being made for the enhancement for the next rollout. And they have a whole separate step-by-step instructions of how they're going to install that application into production. And that process is used to do that typically in development as well as a test environment. And that also gives them an opportunity to fine-tune those step-by-step instructions. But then we look at on the IT side, and we have our infrastructure and our network team, and they typically don't do things in a versionized way like that. So for example, somebody wants to make a change in a firewall rule. You have a new application that is going to be rolled out, and so you have to write up a process on how you're going to make that firewall change. And that process may be that you're going to log in as the administrator, you're going to make a backup copy of the firewall rule set. So in case anything goes wrong, you can always copy those back. You have a rollback plan. And then those instructions will say, I'm going to open up port 80 on an IP address, ABC XXX 123. And then your process should include how that's going to be tested. So I use my cell phone to test to see if I could access that website, and yes, it worked. Or Well, I wasn't able to get to that website, so something was wrong. So you have to go back to a rollback plan. So step-by-step procedures. You can have a lot of different procedures under a single policy. Baselines. So when we talked about workstations that were being rolled out, what you like to do, what you need to do, is you look at the security settings on that workstation, and those are in the registry. There's a lot of different ways that you can look at those. I'll When I post this webinar, I'll post a website as well called CI Security, which has some baselines for best practices for security settings within Windows, within Apple. They have them also on network equipment. So just about any equipment, Linux servers, any of those things, they have some baselines. And the same thing is true in that workstation when we talked about the image. You're documenting what is on that workstation, and so that you have a comparison. And maybe a year later, then you want to do another baseline to see if there have been changes in that. From time to time, someone may inadvertently make a change in one of those security settings when they thought they were changing something else. So you need to check that from time to time. So think of a baseline as having a starting place and then being able to audit that process to make sure that everything is going well. So on the Texas Gateway portal, we have posted a template of an information security policy. We have changed a name, and it now reads name of your entity. You will see throughout the document it refers to NYE. That's not New York Stock Exchange. That is indeed the name of your entity. Theoretically, you could go out there and change that to your name, and you would probably be 60% have a document that you could use. But again, policies are specifically set in some ways to your environment, and we'll talk about more about that as we move along. You will also notice that we have a revision date out there. So as part of your policy, and we'll talk about these sections, but section 1 is kind of generic policy. So you have an introduction. You have a purpose for this policy. You have a general policy. In your security policy development and maintenance plan, this is where you will state how you develop your security policy plans, how often you review those plans on a regular basis. So that helps with the revision date. For example, many people think that you should review your policies every 2 years. Some people say you need to review those every year. That's just dependent upon you and how often you may encounter changes. As well as you may encounter a change within a policy in between the standard times that you update that or revise that policy. For example, you'll see in section 2 where we have a highlighted, revised, and a new date out there, indicating that something has changed recently. And in this case, portable computing, mobile computing, that environment changes quite frequently as technology is rapidly changing. So again, that notifies your users that there has been a change that they can readily identify. In section 2, we have what we typically call policies that apply primarily to your end users. and there are 12 of those that we have out there. Acceptable use, so you talk about what's acceptable use and what's not. You have account management, where you talk about user IDs and how those are managed. You have a data classification policy and talking about how you classify your data, whether that's potentially regulated confidential information or public information. We'll go into more detail on that policy in a little bit. Email policy, how you use email, what's acceptable within that parameter. We have a malicious code policy. You say, well, why would you have a malicious code policy? Well, you want to make sure that your users understand that they should not be introducing something that is potentially malicious within your infrastructure. So that malicious code basically says that it is against policy rules to introduce something that you know or suspect may be malicious. Network access talks about how people access the network. We have a password policy, and that's why you say, well, our password policy may be 8 characters long. You're going to change it every 90 days. There's typically specifications as to how you control and monitor your passwords. Portable computing, that talks about phones, laptops. That also would cover USBs, CDs, any of those things that would be considered as portable to move data around. Privacy policy, security awareness policy, software licensing policy, and the last policy is an exception policy. A lot of people say, you have an exception policy? And yes, you need an exception policy, because no matter how well you write policies, you're going to come up with exceptions. So you need a policy that says, okay, if we find something that falls outside of our policies that we can't fix readily, and we'll cover this more, you need to have an exception policy and a process on how to handle exceptions. Another thing that I include in the first page of that is how to get a hold of information security. So I include a link on there for somebody can quickly drop information security a note. Each of the policies is actually a URL into the document. So if I were to click on, say, acceptable use, it would take me directly to that policy. So that makes it easy for our users to go, oh, I haven't reviewed that in a while. Maybe I need to go back and take a look at that. So you want to make it as easy as possible for users to find the policies and see what's applicable to them. There is a third section of these information security policies that primarily apply to IT, information technologies. And that has to do with administrators and privileged access policy. You've got a backup and a disaster recovery policy. Talk just briefly about a change management policy. You want that included. An incident management policy. So if you have a security incident, you have a policy and you have procedures in which you can follow to remediate that. Have an intrusion detection policy, so that you say who can be looking at your network and who shouldn't be looking at your network. You don't want somebody that's unauthorized, looking at your network doing intrusion detection. That falls outside the scope of their job responsibilities. You have a network configuration policy that talks about how you configure your networks. A physical access security policy. Sometimes we see that included in Section 2 for our end user policies. because oftentimes we have locked doors and man traps and to get into any of your facilities, as well as into any facilities where information is stored, whether it's digital or whether it's paper. So a lot of times you'll see that physical access security policy in Section 2. So it's readily movable between Section 2 and 3. You have a system development policy. So you want to have a policy that says, oh, we're going to develop a new system, and how's that going to be done? Many of us have to rely on outside vendors to do that. And so that information that we include in the contracts when we're dealing with those users should follow the guidelines of what's established in your system development policy. You have a security monitoring policy. For security reasons, security team or your IT team may need to look at email or look at files that you have for discovery for a potential lawsuit or for a public information request. So you need to have a policy that identifies who has the permissions to do those types of searches. System security talks about your systems, whether those are workstations or whether those are servers. And the last policy that we have in that section has to do with vendor access. And that's also commonly referred to as partner access. Most of us today do not do 100% of our data information within in-house. We depend on partners to provide other services for us. Some of us have information in the cloud that we have partners that we do business with. So again, we have to have a policy that gives us some guidelines of how we monitor and work with those partners. And again, that would be something that would be included in the contract when you're dealing with your vendors. So I want to cover a couple of different policies so that you get a general idea of the things that we include in a policy that should be there. So I'm going to cover, first of all, we're going to cover acceptable use policy. And in every policy, they're formatted pretty much the same. We'll have an introduction. You should have a purpose, and then we'll get into the meat of the policy. In this case, for acceptable use, it has three basic concepts of introduction. It is to ensure compliance with applicable statutes, regulations, mandates requiring management of information resources, the establishment of prudent and acceptable practices regarding the use of information resources, and to educate individuals who may use information resources with the respect to their responsibilities associated with such use. As you can see, those three statements are pretty broad statements. So you can see that those are, very generic, and then we're going to start working down into some different layers. In this case, with the acceptable use, we defined who owns electronic files. Electronic files created, sent, received, stored on information resources owned, leased, administered, or otherwise under the custody and control of your entity or the property of your entity. So if I put a personal email, receive a personal email, and I leave it stored in my email box somewhere, or I put a photograph from my vacation out on a drive somewhere, that isn't just my property any longer. It is considered property of your entity. And then we talk about privacy with those files. It says any of those files under your control are not private and may be accessed by certain employees at any time without knowledge of the information resources user or owner. Electronic files content may be accessed by the appropriate personnel in accordance with provisions and safeguards provided through your entity. So you're letting people know right up front that who owns the files and that they, what kind of privacy they can expect in those files. We're going to get into some more details regarding the acceptable use policy, and one of the things that when you're reading policy, it becomes very mundane. But by putting a highlighted background in important pieces, it draws the user's attention to where they could focus more readily on what is most important. So in this case, you will see we have some highlighted blue areas to draw the attention to the reader and the users. And so it covers some of the things that computer resources must be used in a manner that complies with policy, state laws, federal laws, and regulations. It talks about that is against policy to install or run software requiring a license that without a valid license. So somebody brings in some software that they made a copy from home or for another resource. They want to load it on their machine. You may not want to allow that. That is a copyright infringement. So you want to make sure that your policy states and that they can easily see that is a policy violation. This particular policy also talks about software that's authorized. All software must be authorized for use, and a list of authorized software is maintained in Appendix A, and we'll talk about Appendix in just a moment. Individuals, must request written approval for software. Unauthorized software is subject to removal upon discovery. Computing and network infrastructure by employees unrelated to the use of those computers, unrelated to their positions, must be limited both in time and resources and must not interfere in any way with your organization's functions or the employee's duties. It is the responsibility of the employees to consult with their supervisors if they have any any questions about this respect. This is the first line in this policy that talks basically about incidental use, but it's put up front so that readers quickly can see that they're, yes, it's acceptable to maybe browse the internet for a few minutes, but again, that's limited time and resources. Again, it's stated in a broad statement because most important thing is here it says consult with your supervisors in regard to respect to questions about those matters. So it could vary within an organization. It doesn't put a time or how much time you can spend doing that type of thing. It is really up to the supervisor and the employees as to how they want to handle that. The acceptable use continues to go on and talks about, for example, you cannot use computer resources for personal profit. That is not permitted. Files, images, emails, documents which may cause legal action against or embarrassment to your organization may not be sent, received, or accessed in any format. Auditably, verbally, visually, they should not be downloaded or stored on your entity's information resources. Again, we re-emphasize that messages, files, and documents, including personal messages, files, and documents located on our information resources are owned by the organization and may be subject to Open Records Acts and may be accessed in accordance with this policy. There's a clause here that talks about decryption of passwords is not permitted except by authorized staff performing security reviews or investigations. There's a clause here that talks about network sniffers. So, who is authorized to put a network sniffer on the network to analyze the network? Maybe you're troubleshooting in some way or fashion. And in this case, it says that a network sniffer must be approved by the IRM, and under definition, there's a definition section for this template. That's the CIO or Information Resource Manager. You can change who you want to provide approval for that, but it's just designed so that that someone has to have approval. Must not be used to monitor or track the individual's network except under special authorization as defined by policy, protecting the privacy of the information in the electronic form. So even though I'm security, that doesn't give me the right to investigate anybody I want to. It means that I have to have special authorizations to be looking at someone's email or looking at documents, trying to find activity or anything like that. So it clearly defines what is appropriate for the users. And then again, we have another clause here that deals with downloading, installing, and running programs that utilize on their systems, except those that are authorized. I don't like anyone having admin rights on their workstations. So this has a clause that says it must be installed by the IT department and specifically designed to conduct business by your entity. And it gives an example of, for example, unauthorized peer-to-peer file sharing software, gaming, unauthorized instant messaging. It lists music files, image files, free software, shareware. And again, it states unauthorized software may be removed upon discovery. So all of the policies typically try to reinforce things that you feel from a managerial intent is important. And then here we again go back into the incidental use. As a convenience to our user community, incidental use of information resources may be permitted. And here are the restrictions. Cannot interfere with your normal performance of employees' work duties, storage of personal emails, voicemails, files, documents within the information resources must be nominal. Again, there's no set amount. People receive personal emails sometimes, and they sometimes put personal files out on the hardware. So it states nominal. And again, then we talk about messages, files, documents, including personal messages, files, and documents located, belong to the entity and may be subject to open records request and may be accessed in accordance with this policy. And the last two things that I always include in policy is that I have a support information, which we, in the very first section, says is supported by the security policy standard. So that is, again, it reinforces that we have a standard for our policies. And I also like to include disciplinary action in every individual policy. So this is basically a summary of your disciplinary action and violation policy that states, and basically a violation of this policy may result in disciplinary action which may include termination. Individuals are subject to loss of information resource access privileges as well as potential civil and criminal prosecution. Violation of this policy or aggregate security policies are subject to the guides established in the violation of disciplinary action policies. And the last thing that I include in every policy is a revision history. So I like to show that the version, so these can be updated once a year, twice a year, whenever you as an organization think your policies need to be updated. It states who the author was, the date that they were written, any comments, who approved them, and the approval date. So on every policy, I follow this same type of format. Now earlier we talked about an appendix to the acceptable use policy. And this falls into that layer of where we're setting guidelines. And this has to do with what is approved software. And we have, in this particular case, we have software that are comprised of 3 categories: level 1, level 2, and level 3. So level 1 software includes operating systems, networking, application software, which is licensed and is fully supported and is IT pre-installed on every workstation. So whether you're running Windows or whether you're running Apple, the Office applications that you have, all of those things would be covered under level 1 if they're included on that image. Level 2 covers application software that is, again, IT installed, fully supported, and licensed, but it's licensed on an as-needed basis. So, you may have applications that you go, well, I really don't need to buy 1,000 licenses of Visio when I'm only going to have 200 people that use that that really use that application. So in this case, somebody has to track the number of licenses that you're using. So we have a process here that says it. Now, a request, a software requires a written supervisor or team leader authorization request, again, to the CIO or the information resource manager for approval prior to installation. So we establish a process, in this case, on how level 2 software is how you can acquire that. We move to level 3, and at level 3 application software, again, IT must verify that it's licensed, or it may be shareware. It installs the software upon request, but it is not IT supported. For example, from time to time, we have people that come to us and say, I use my personal camera to take photographs so we can do this documentation or this documentation, and I need my camera software loaded on my workstation. So, okay, all I need is authorization from your supervisor, your team leader, and we'll put that software on your computer. But you need to know that it's not supported, and if there's a problem with your workstation after the installation, the only thing we're going to do is re-image that workstation. So it's kind of up to the user. They're on their own, but they think that that's something that they need to enhance their productivity within the organization. It's allowed, but in this case, we say we're really not going to help you. So you can't call me and ask me how to use that software, or expect that you'll have a help desk support of that. So those are 3 examples of setting a guideline that's outside your policies, but we set it up as an appendix. And so you can change this list as an appendix, and just make a note of that it's been changed back on the front page. Also want to talk a little bit about data classification policy. Again, we see standard things here. We have an introduction. We have a purpose. It talks about all data must be reviewed on a periodic basis and classified according to use, sensitivity, and importance. To ensure proper protection of information resources, various levels of classification may be applied. Again, very broad statement. Again, we see a blue background here, so we catches our attention to know that that's important. In this particular policy, we have three classifications. We have a high risk, and that has to do with information assets where there are legal requirements for preventing disclosure or financial penalties for disclosure. For example, data that's covered by federal, state legislation such as FERPA, HIPAA, Data Protection Act. In addition to that, payroll, personnel, financial information can also be in this class because of the privacy requirements. So our high risk is where we have sensitive information, and we should apply the highest risk, the highest group of security to protect that classification as possible. We also have a second classification here called confidential, which says data that would not expose your entity to a loss if disclosed, but the data owner feels that it needs to be protected against unauthorized disclosure. It is the data owner's responsibility to implement the necessary security requirements, and we'll talk about that in just a second. I'll give you an example. So you may have, excuse me, I'll give an example of an investment brokerage. They have customers out there. They may have my social security number. They may have information about me. They've got some of my resources, and that for them is classified as high risk. But one of the most important things that they have is they also have investment formulas. So they'll have a formula that says if this and this and this change, then we need to either be investing in this market or that market, or we need to be doing different things. So they have formulas, and they consider those extremely high risk because that's telling them how they're doing business. So that would be an example of someone that had something that wasn't just regulations, but say, hey, this is really critical data for us, and we don't want that disclosed to the public. And the last classification that we have here is public information, information that may be freely disseminated. All information resources should be categorized and protected according to the requirements set by each classification. The data classification and its corresponding levels of protection should be consistent when the data is replicated or as it flows throughout your organization. So, and then that policy continues that we talk about network connections. So no owner or owned system or network subnet may connect to the internet without the means to protect the information on those systems consistent with their confidentiality classification. So this is basically saying we're not going to put anything out there that's public out to the internet until it's been classified, and we make sure that it has the protection consistent with how it's classified. Custodians are responsible. Typically, your custodian could be a vendor that you're working with, or could be your own in-house IT shop is responsible for creating data repositories and data transfer procedures which protect data in a manner appropriate to their classification. So it is the custodian's responsibility to make sure that they have all of those layers of security that are there to protect that information depending on how it's classified. Within this data classification, we talk about backups. And you go, well, we have a whole policy about backups, right? But it's important to remember that all appropriate data should be backed up, and the backups tested periodically and are part of the documented regular process. Backups must be handled with the same security precaution as the data itself. So those backups that we create in case we have a disaster recovery should have the same security levels implemented within them as the data when it's in production. And there's a reason for that. You know, you say, well, we store our tapes in an off-site. Somebody comes and picks those tapes up, takes them off-site in case this building is destroyed by some natural disaster. And that's a great process for disaster recovery. But the people that may be transporting those could be involved in an accident. They could be delivered to the wrong place. There's a lot of things that could happen. And then you potentially have sensitive information that could be exposed because of your backups. So you need to make sure that your policy says your backups are going to be protected the same manner as that data that's in your production. And so that's included in this policy under classified data. And again, you know, we talked about support information, and again here at the bottom of this policy is the disciplinary action summary and a revision history. I do want to touch the exception policy, just so that people have an understanding. What's the purpose of an exception policy? An exception is a method used to document variations from the rules. Okay? A very broad statement. And within that, then we're going to talk about some of the things that might require an exception. For example, required commercial or software in use is not currently available to support certain features. Legacy systems that cannot be brought up to security compliance codes. This is a very common reason that you have exceptions. Or the fact that it's cost prohibitive to be compliant. You know, disproportionate relative to the potential damage. So you can write an exception. In this case, there's an exception process that to submit that, and there's even an exception should it be rejected. There's an appeal process in this, but it documents something that's against your policies. One of the key things in the steps for permitting and documenting an exception is the last step, and it says each exception must be re-examined according to an assigned schedule. The schedule may vary from 3 months to 12 months, depending on the nature of the exception. So you want exceptions to expire. You know, so somebody goes, oh, we've got this legacy system out here, and we're trying to bring up new software on a new server that will get rid of these problems, but it's going to take us 6 months. You say, okay, I'll write an exception for 6 months, and you go back in 6 months and go, oh, we're behind. We're another 3 months out. Okay, then you write an exception for 3 months. So again, you don't want an open-ended exception. You always want to have a termination date, an expiration date for that exception. Again, we're going to talk about, we have support information, the disciplinary action, and the revision history within that. So that covers just touching some of the policies and how some of the concepts of standards can be applied. As the case, we had an appendix in there of acceptable software. We're going to talk briefly about the information security acknowledgement and non-disclosure agreement. And many policies will require that anyone accessing systems are required to formally acknowledge a non-disclosure agreement before they're allowed to have access to those resources. Formally acknowledge meaning that you have to actually sign and date something. So I'll cover this form quickly so we've got plenty of time for questions. And I like to have that form on one page if we can possibly do that. So again, we're going to talk pretty much in very broad terms here. We have the user's name and the division name of that person. We're going to talk about, as a user and I'm accessing information resources, I understand that I may have access to information that is private in nature or that's classified as confidential or high risk. Now, I've read the information security policy and agree to follow the established guidelines. I will not disclose private, confidential, or high-risk information to unauthorized parties. Unless my job duties require, I will not access private, confidential, or high-risk information. I won't share my password to log in to computer systems or applications, and I will not use a user ID belonging to someone else. So those two are related. I won't share my password, and I won't use somebody else's password. Again, those are two things that are important when we talk about auditing and separation of duties. So those are why those are included in there. I will not enter data or change any data that I do not have permission to enter or change. I will not use, load, install, or operate software on information resources without the permission of the IT division. Again, that depends on your policies. I agree to immediately notify the Information Technology Division if I know or suspect violations of the information security policy. That could read that you'll notify information security if you know or suspect violations. And then I understand that any violations of the policy could result in disciplinary action, revoking of computer access, and may subject me to criminal penalties. And there's a place there and a date for someone to sign that. Additionally, I like to include that the supervisor or their team lead acknowledges that this person, no matter whether they're an employer or contractor, has been provided access to the information security policy. And I also acknowledge that this employee has been provided with only the computer access needed to do their job. This goes back to the premises of least privileges. And then the supervisor signs it. We actually take our non-disclosure and put that in a help desk electronically. We scan that document in. So when an auditor comes in and says, I'm looking at Frosty Walker has access to this information. Can I look and see at his non-disclosure? Yes, we can pull that up for you. And that's where all of them are kept in an electronic format. So if they find something that would indicate that I might have violated policy on when they're reviewing an audit, then I've signed that I acknowledge that there are violations to that. I also recommend that you have your non-disclosure statement re-signed every couple, maybe 3 years. Information security policies change. So if you could have someone that's been working for you for 20 years, and what did information security policies look like 20 years ago? And if they haven't reviewed those policies and you've updated your non-disclosure agreement, then they go, well, I didn't know that was our policies. So this is an example of a information security acknowledgement and non-disclosure that we've included out in the portal. The last thing I'm going to talk about today is guidelines for drafting security documentation. Some guidelines you need to understand how security documentation provides a common framework for everyone to work together and achieve organizational goals. Consider security documentation as a roadmap to good governance. Become acquainted with the various types and how they're different. Policies, standards, guidelines, procedures, baselines. All of those fit into that pyramid that we displayed earlier. Plan your security operations using 3 levels of planning. Your strategic, where your policies are, your tactical, where your standards and guidelines are, and your operational and project planning can be by project basis, and that's where your procedures and your baselines are. Meet the following objectives when drafting security policies. Define your organizational security goals. Be sure you inform your employees about their security-related duties and responsibilities, and outline a computer system security requirements. And always consider the relationships between the different document types and how they influence one another. From time to time, we'll get somebody that comes in and goes, I was reading this policy or this procedure that we have, and it says we do this, this, and this, but when I look back at our policies, that's against policy. Oh, okay. We need to review that procedure, because someone may have written that procedure that wasn't fully understanding the policy that we had in place. So those are some of the guidelines about security documentation, and while they're not exciting to talk about, they are very critical to your organization and making sure that your users understand the intent and how they should be using your systems, and how you're protecting those systems as well. So with that, I'll open it up for additional questions. I've not had any questions at this time, but if anybody, let's see here. I'm reading through some of the comments. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody letting me know that they can see my slides and hear me. From time to time, we might have some problems. Had some people that did experience some audio problems today. Have a specific, DIR talks about having a security catalog standards. That is a different document than information security policies. I will add some information when we. I'll get some additional information on the catalog for you, and I'll include that when in the next week or so, as soon as I can get that posted. Someone asked me to repeat the URL for the Texas Gateway. It is https://www.texasgateway.com. And that will be posted with the seminar. And that's all the questions that I have. Let's see, I think I've got maybe just a second here remaining in our time. I'll go back and show that URL again. Texas Gateway, https://www.texasgateway.org, I'm sorry, under Cybersecurity Tips and Tools. Thank you all very much for attending today. We'll get this webinar posted in the next couple of days. If you have any other questions, please feel free to drop me a line at frosty.walker@tea.texas.gov. Thank you very much. Have a great day.